Okay, it is 4 minutes till. We're going to start at 7 o'clock, so everybody get comfortable and we'll start shortly. Okay.
I think so. This one's just maybe a kinky. Long lost artifacts. It's right here in Fifth Mister?
Yeah, right here. So Rich will come in and price it, but it'll just be better if I can look this direction. Thank you. We've got 3 minutes. That'd be great. We are live. I'll show you. Hey, Tom. Yeah. Get over it.
I'm doing good. You okay? Good. Traffic is just awful.
Where you come from? What direction?
Binder.
Oh, wow.
Yes, it is awful.
You made it.
Then I got left work late. I usually at 5, so I can come up this way.
Mm-hmm.
And
Tis the season.
you know, well, you can do this. You know, it's like that.
Mm-hmm.
And Goodwill is my bottom between Dollar Tree, Goodwill, and Walmart. Those about my favorite things there. I love Goodwill. And this one up here,
What you gonna find?
and this one up here at the Value Mart. I get that big one. Oh, I love that stuff.
Yeah.
Love it.
And so you never know, I'm kind of a bad collector,
Mm-hmm.
or it'll be good, I don't know,
My wife was down on me. She told me, don't you bring nothing else in.
but.
Don't you bring nothing else here. And I had I bought a jacket from the Goodwill and no, thank you. And the jacket got very back in the back, in the back, in the back. And I was cleaning out. And mother was going to help me, I don't like her, but she just did it, just keep going. And she says to me, she said, Tony, if you ain't missed this stuff by now, you're not going to miss it. Just keep it. Really not right now. But that particular jacket, when I saw that jacket, I said, oh, no. I gotta keep that one. I gotta keep that one.
Okay, we got about a minute to go here and we're going to start. We got some folks out tonight. We should have back hopefully next week. Pat suffered an injury, so she's at home and Lyle's faithfully tending to her needs. She did, she had an ankle. And then Rich is supposed to be here, but Rich had rotator cuff surgery, so he's had to get a ride. Yeah. It could be him right there. Hey, Matthew. Come on in the house.
You just be surprised if you find me.
Hey, y'all.
Spot there, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're okay.
Did you have your comfort?
We have no assigned seating.
So
You can stretch out down there, you're at the end.
You just had lessons here. And I'm the first one here. Well, I'll sit where, if he's looking at just me, he'll still be facing the camera.
That's why Esther, she don't mind sitting on that side, so. Yeah.
Great.
You brought in the crowds.
You got anybody else coming tonight?
No, because, Pat was hurt, she injured herself. And I didn't get all the details. I'm sure she's watching me say all this now, but I think she hurt her ankle. I think that's what Lyle said. So she's recuperating. Well, some of this stuff I'm going to go ahead and cover because this, I know Rich isn't taking the class for credit, and this is mostly for those who are watching online who have not been in the class, one of my classes before, so let me just cover this. If you're watching online and you're an online student, regular online student, we will be sending you this information by email tonight. Everybody in the class will get the outline tomorrow morning. And you'll also get the syllabus and then this handout. I've got a handout that I gave to everybody. It's called Interesting Facts About Haggai. Let's talk about Haggai tonight. Nehemiah is another book. Make sure that everybody gets those. But anyway, just quickly to cover this on the syllabus that you'll be getting. What we're covering in this class for 7 weeks, 2 hours per time, is the final three books of the minor prophets or of the Old Testament. So we're going to be talking about Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. We will be taking off December 25th and January 1st. Other than that, we'll be going from 7 till 9 o'clock.
Nothing.
Okay.
Yeah.
There you go. Oh, okay. Here. Okay. There you go. Okay, so successfully completing the class by your attendance, by taking the tests and doing the paper, brings you 1 hour of credit for successfully completing those things. You can earn an additional hour of credit if you want 2 credits, but you're going to have a lot more work, so that's up to you, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The only text I require in here is the Bible. There are some good commentaries out there if you want to get one, but I don't have any particular one that I recommend. The course requirements are class attendance if you are taking the class online for credit, and what I require of you is that every Tuesday morning after class, sometime by Tuesday evening, you send me by email a copy of your notes that you took during the class. That way I'll be able to confirm that you were watching the class. There are 3 exams. There's going to be one after each book. Tonight we're going to cover the whole book of Haggai, all of it, 2 chapters. And I'll send you a test in the morning, which will be due back into me by next Monday night. There'll be a research paper. You may pick any subject, verse, or section of verses from one of the books being studied. The main thing about this is the basis of it has to be based on Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So in other words, I don't want a paper that talks about certain subject and makes an occasional reference to Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. It's got to be exegetical. It's got to come from the passages in one of those 3 books. The paper required is 6 pages minimum, typed in 12-point Times New Roman font, double-spaced, maximum ½ inch margin on all sides, with proper citations of sources and footnotes. And yes, that is specific, and it's that way for a purpose. Topic must be approved by me. So by December 18th, which is 2 weeks from tonight, if you are, again, taking the class for credit, if you're auditing it, you don't need to do this unless you just want to. If you're taking the class for credit, 2 weeks from tonight, I need your topic along with a purpose statement. And a purpose statement basically is this. In this paper, I intend to such and such. If you want to prove something, if you want to talk about something, I just need to know where you're going with it. And then you send that to me and I'll approve that or make suggestions on it. The paper itself is due by class time on January 29th, so that'll give you the whole month of January to write that. And let's see, already talked about those couple of points. If you want to earn 2 credits, there are some additional things you can do. You'll see that on your syllabus. This is very important for the credit students to know that I need to be advised if you're not going to make a class. You guys who are here physically, you are taking it online. If you can't make that class, please let me know. It's very important. Unexcused absences will not be appreciated and will meet with great wrath and displeasure. And also you'll get your final grade knocked down by 5% for each one. So all that said, don't miss a class. If you have something that comes up like work or family or illness or whatever it might be and you need to miss a class, Just letting you know in advance. You can have 2 unexcused absences after that. We'll need to talk a little bit. If you do want to drop the class, if you don't want to take it for credit anymore, I need to know by December 18th, 2 weeks from tonight, that you've decided not to take the class for credit. Other than, if you don't do that, then you're going to go on record as taking it for credit. And if you don't finish it, you'll get an incomplete, which you don't want. Okay, I think that's it. Anybody in here have any questions? Tony said, I knew that from memory. Heard that many times. Okay. All right, so let's talk about Haggai. Again, you'll get these notes by email tomorrow, so if you don't get everything, don't worry about it. The reason I do this, for those who are in my class for the first time, the reason I don't give the notes up front is because I want you to take your own notes. You may hear some things or think of some things that I don't have in my outline, and if I give you the outline up front, I'm afraid I'm going to squelch your thoughts. So I want you to make your own notes, your own outline, and again, if you think of something that I don't, which is very, very probable and most likely going to happen, let's have discussion. I'm sorry, those of you online, I'm not in a position yet to have an interactive class. Maybe we can do that eventually if I figure out the technology. But those of you in here, just speak up so the folks online can hear your comments. We always have great comments, and I really appreciate that. All right, Haggai, the central message of Haggai is this: Judah. And when we're talking about Judah, we're talking about the southern kingdom, because again, by this time, the northern kingdom, of course, and the southern kingdom had divided all the way back in 1 Kings chapter 13. And by this time, according to 2 Kings chapter 17, the northern kingdom was gone. Israel was gone. But the southern kingdom had been in existence. And they had gone into Babylonian captivity, which eventually became the Medo-Persian captivity. But they had come back. And Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, writing toward the end, again, chronologically, these books are placed pretty well in the Old Testament. The central message is Judah needs to arise from their complacency and get back to the Lord's work, specifically rebuilding the temple. Now, I wondered, is this a book that has no relevance today? Is there any complacency at all today? Is there any complacency among God's people today? Is there ever a time that we look and say, you know, we're just really sitting around and not doing much of anything? Do we have to wrestle with that? Is that still a temptation today to be complacent? Everybody agree that that is? Okay, it's still something we have to deal with. Are you left-handed, Rich?
Yeah.
You're amazing. You are now.
I have that 5-year-old hand on there.
Oh, okay, well, it's still better than mine. So, all right. So about the prophet Haggai, the name Haggai means my feast, or it could also mean the festal one. The bottom line, it has reference to a feast. And some say he perhaps got his name because, you know, names were quite significant during that time. They had a meaning. Ours still have meaning, but generally we don't name our children based on any particular meaning. We name them after family or just something that's the latest and greatest craze or whatever it might be. But perhaps he was born on a feast day. And some suggest that his name was given to him by his parents exiled in Babylon, who optimistically anticipated the return of God's people. And they were anticipating the day when there would be feasts back in their homeland of Jerusalem. So they named him in a positive sense.
Is it the same word as Titus?
No, sure isn't.
Okay, just starting to
Yeah, that's not quite. Haggai lived during the time of the captivity of Judah, prophesied in the early days of the return of the Jews. He was a contemporary of Zechariah. So when we get done with Haggai tonight, next week we jump into Zechariah. We're going to be talking about guys who were teammates. They were working together for the same cause. Zechariah goes further than Haggai does. We're going to find that Haggai has a reference to the Messiah, but Zechariah goes into even greater detail than he does. Through the efforts of Haggai and Zechariah, the Jews in Jerusalem prospered, according to Ezra chapter 6 and verse 14. Now, about the book itself, there are some things that are rather unique about the book. One of them is the fact that there are no denunciations of immoral conduct. Okay, let's go back. Everybody here has been familiar with the previous 9 minor prophets that were covered. Okay. Did any of the minor prophets previous to Haggai have anything to say about the disobedience of the Jews? Not just a little bit either, right? I mean, they were pretty straightforward in denouncing the ungodly activities of these folks. They were doing things like worshiping idols and offering children as sacrifices and things like that. So this book is somewhat unique in that it doesn't denounce any particular moral conduct. There's an emphasis here. There is a reference to their disobedience, but the emphasis here is get back to work. The focus is get back to work. So this is actually a great encouragement and example to us, I think, to consider when we need to be strengthened, when we need to be encouraged, when we're trying to encourage others to be diligent in God's service. Get back to work. This book was written probably about the year 520 BC. As we see in chapter 1 and verse 1, and chapter 2 and verse 10, it was written in the second year of Darius. We'll talk about Darius in just a little bit. The book was written, the events of the book took place over a 4-month period. Again, in chapter 1 and verse 1, he talks about the 6th month, the first day of the month. You go to chapter 2 and verse 10, the final section of it. It talks about the 24th day of the 9th month. So he's going from the 6th month into the 9th month. So we're talking about approximately a 4-month period. We're going to divide it up into 4 sections for our study. Each section begins with this phrase, the word of the Lord came. Maybe your version says something a little bit different, but the word of the Lord came. So for instance, in chapter 1 and verse 1, in the King James it says, came the word of the Lord. In chapter 2 in verse 1, came the word of the Lord. In chapter 2 in verse 10, came the word of the Lord. Chapter 2 in verse 20, the word of the Lord came. Okay, so those are our 4 designations there. Beginning chapter 1, verse 1 through verse 15. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. I'll repeat these when we get to them. Chapter 2, 10 through 19. Chapter 2, 20 through 23. Okay, so let's talk a little background information. To really grasp what Haggai and then Zechariah are talking about, we want to go back to the book of Ezra. So keep your marker there in Haggai. We'll come back to it in just a little bit. Let's see what's going on. Let's look into the history book and see what's happening here. 1. You recall that Jerusalem had been captured. The people of Judah had been taken off into captivity by the Babylonians. There was a 70-year period in which they had been captive there. But by the end of 2 Chronicles, we find that Cyrus, the Persian king, had risen to power. The Babylonians had been overthrown. At the time of Judah's release, they were under the rule of Cyrus, the king of Persia. In Ezra chapter 1, beginning in verse 2, thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. Now, we're not here to talk about Israel in his book. But will you think about that just for a minute? Here, Jerusalem, Judah, had been taken into a land of idolaters, Babylon. Babylon was eventually overthrown because of their pride in conjunction with their idolatry. But while those people were there, some of those Jewish people had a powerful influence for truth. So much so that we know, for instance, Nebuchadnezzar was impressed, wasn't he? And then we remember Daniel. What about the book of Daniel? Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We read about those 4 faithful individuals. So here is a man in a foreign country. He's not part of Judah, Cyrus. He's the king. And he is declaring that Jehovah is the God. Now, that's such a small sentence there, but to me that's so impressive. It speaks of the influence that these faithful people of Judah were having, even in captivity. And it impressed Cyrus so that he said, I want to send you back home. And in fact, we'll even find that they helped pay for it. They funded their return back. So chapter 1, verses 2 and following of Ezra, Cyrus decreed that any who wished to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple could do so with his approval. Let's look at 2 Chronicles 36, verses 18 and 19. Let's all share a little bit tonight. I want to do a little reading. Emily, you look like you're getting there close. 2 Chronicles 36, verses 18 and 19.
Okay.
36, 18, and 19. Yeah.
Okay. And all the articles from the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his leaders, all these he took to Babylon. Then they burned the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious possessions.
Okay, so what happened to the temple? It was burned down, and the walls were burned down. Nehemiah, when we talk about Nehemiah, recall how Nehemiah went back to rebuild the walls. The temple needed to be rebuilt. The Jews were going back to Jerusalem, and this was still going to be their center of worship under the Old Covenant and the law of Moses. The temple needed to be rebuilt. So under Cyrus's edict, several thousands of them returned to Jerusalem. Now, let's go to Ezra chapter 3. Chapter 2 of Ezra gives a list of many of those who did go back, and it gives the total chapter 2 verse 64 says there were 42,360. Okay, beside their servants and maids, and it lists those as well. There were a lot of people who went back. Chapter 3 of Ezra, verse 11 says, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. They went back to do what Cyrus sent them to do, what God wanted them to do, to rebuild the temple. Look in verse 12. Tony, read if you got Ezra 3 and verse 12.
Ezra 3, verse 12, King James, but he says, the men of the priests and Levites and chief of the fathers, who were ancient men, they had seen the first house. When the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, wept a loud voice, and many shouted aloud for joy.
Okay, we're going to talk about that when we get into Haggai chapter 2, because here the people are, the older people are sad. The foundation's been laid. We're going to talk about when we get into chapter 2 why they were sad. Now, they rebuilt the foundation. They got the foundation laid. Rich, have you got Ezra chapter 4 there?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do verses 1 and 2.
Ezra 4.
Ezra 4, verses 1 and 2.
From the American Standard.
Okay.
Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of the captivity were building a temple unto Jehovah, the God of Israel, then they drew near to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the fathers' houses, and said unto them, let us build with you, for we seek your God as ye do, and we sacrifice unto him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us up thither.
Okay, so the temple's been destroyed, 70 years gone past. Jerusalem is being rebuilt. The temple is being rebuilt. Things are looking pretty good. Some, there's joy, there's melancholy. Now here come some Samaritans, and they say, we want to join you. We follow Jehovah too. What's the problem with that? On the surface, does it look like, hey, great, we get more bodies. We'll get more done faster now. Look back in 2 Kings chapter 17. Keep your finger here. Now you got two fingers, one in Haggai and one in Ezra. Well, let's look in 2 Kings 17 just for a minute. We won't read all of this. 2 Kings 17 is talking about when Israel was overthrown. But what it does is it shows us essentially the origin of the Samaritans. Samaria was already there, of course, and Israel was the capital of Israel. But after the Israelites were taken away by the Assyrians, look what happened. 2 Kings 17, verse 24, the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, from Cutha, from Ava, from Hamath, from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof. And so it was, verse 25 says, at the beginning of their dwelling there, that they feared not the Lord. Okay, so these idolaters were brought in to take the place of the Israelites who had been there. When they got there, they continued worshiping their idols. Many of them were eaten up by lions, destroyed by lions. So the king of Assyria decided, we need to send somebody from Israel down there. So he sends some Israelites down there to mingle in with them, figuring that's going to make everything good in the land. Go back to, go down to verse 31 now. Well, verse 30 and verse 31 talk about them continuing to offer to their gods. But look at verse 32, that's where I want to go. It says, they, speaking of the Samaritans, feared the Lord and made unto themselves of the lowest of them priests of the high places, which sacrificed for them in the houses of the high places. Now look at verse 33. They feared the Lord and served their own gods, after the manner of the nations whom they carried away from thence. Unto this day they do after the former manners. They fear not the Lord, neither do they after their statutes, or after their ordinances, or after the law and commandment which the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. Look at that in verse 33. They feared the Lord and served their own gods. What's the matter with that? Why, they feared Jehovah, right? What's the matter with this? They feared the Lord in what?
Still serve their own God.
They kept serving their own gods. So what was Jehovah in their mind? Was he the one God with a bunch of these man-made gods? Or what was Jehovah in their minds?
He just grouped them in with all the other ones.
Jehovah, Baal, Molech, etc., etc., etc. We're going to worship all of these gods. Okay. So now with that background in mind, we come back to Ezra chapter 4, and you see the Samaritans say, we want to help. We're glad you're back, Judah. We want to help you rebuild. And Zerubbabel says, no, you're not going to help us. Why did he reject their help? We just answered that. Because they were not serving faithfully the one true God. And he was not going to have that mixture going on there. He wanted service, and God expected service faithfully. So, as a result of Zerubbabel rebuffing their efforts to join the rebuilding effort, the Samaritans, as you read on through chapter 4, decided they were going to get even. So they penned a letter to the Persian ruler and warned him about these Jews, suggesting they had a history of rebellion, and if they get their city built again, king, they're going to rebel against you too. You see, we can be forgiven of our past, but sometimes it can still come back and bite us, can't it? And that's exactly what's happening here. So what happened is the king went back into the record books, and guess what he found? They said, King, they're a rebellious people. The king got into the history books. Guess what he found? They're a rebellious people. And so in chapter 4 and verse 19 of Ezra, it says, I commanded, and search has been made, and it's found that this city of old time has made insurrection against kings, and that rebellion is indeed therein. So the king, fearing for his own future and the future of his kingdom, told him to stop. The Samaritans started it. They brought the old history of Israel back. And the king said to stop. 15 years it sat there, the foundation of the temple sat there with nothing being built upon it. And folks, that's where we come to Haggai and Zechariah. That's where we're at. So just picture yourself now in the days of Haggai and Zechariah, because Ezra chapter 5 verse 1 talks about those two. That's how it ties all together there. Let's go back to the book of Haggai. The temple has been instructed to be rebuilt. They got so far as the foundation, they quit. Why'd they quit? Anybody have an idea why they quit? I mean, the king told them to, right? So therefore, if the king says do one thing and God says do something else, we ought to listen to the king, right? Wait a minute. If the king says one thing and God says something else, who should we listen to? We should listen to God. So why did they stop? Why didn't they listen to God? Fear. Yeah, bottom line.
Fear of the king.
Exactly. Fear of the king. But there's more to it than that. That's true. That's at the foundation. That's where it all started. But as the years pass, when we come to Haggai, we're going to find that more developed than that. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Just closing the introductory matters with some distinctive features of the book. This is from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. The writer says the most striking feature in Haggai's message is its repeated claim of divine origin. 5 times in these 38 verses, he tells us that the word of Yahweh or Jehovah came unto him. 4 times he says, thus saith Jehovah of hosts. 5 times he says Jehovah of hosts. 4 times he simply says Jehovah. Altogether he uses the name Jehovah of hosts 14 times, besides 19 repetitions of the single but ineffable name Jehovah. And you'll see this as we're going into this. It is not superfluous. He has a purpose in repeating his name over and over and over again to remind them who they're supposed to be following. And, we've talked about that before. I've talked about that in lessons I've given from Isaiah chapter 42 for about the next 5 or 6 chapters. It's almost like God during that time was reintroducing himself to Judah. And the reason he was doing that is because so many had gone away from him, they forgot who he was and they forgot what his will was. So he's almost having to reintroduce himself. All right, another feature of the book is the word consider. We're going to find the word consider 5 times here in. Look in verse 5 and see what have we got. I've got King James. Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Does everybody else in Haggai 1 verse 5 say consider? Haggai 1 and verse 5.
Consider.
Consider. Okay.
Give careful, Lord, give careful thought.
Give careful thought. Okay. What does that say?
This one
Haggai 1
says,
verse 5.
oh, I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong verse. It does say consider your
Okay.
ways.
And the New American Standard says consider also. So we'll talk about that in just a second. The other part of this book we're going to bring out is the role of Zerubbabel. The role of Zerubbabel in God's plan for redeeming mankind. Okay. If there's one thing, and I've taught these minor prophets for several years, the more I study the minor prophets, the more I personally see a much more messianic message than I had when I previously studied it. I think there's a lot more in these prophecies about the Messiah than we give credit for. Of course, Judaism rejects it. They might say it's messianic, but they won't say it applies to Jesus, but we'll show that it does. Okay, let's talk about the first section. This is verses 1 through 15 of chapter 1. The central message, which would be, of course, the entire chapter, the central message of Haggai chapter 1 is this: get your priorities straight. Chapter 1, the entirety of it, verses 1 through 15, the central message: get your priorities straight. Okay, let's break it up into sections, verses 1 through 6. I'm going to read from the New American Standard here. In the 2nd year of Darius the king, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came by the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, saying, thus says the Lord of hosts, this people says the time is not come, even the time for the house of the Lord to be rebuilt. Then the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house lies desolate? Now therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much, but harvest little. You eat, but there is not enough to be satisfied. You drink, but there is not enough to become drunk. You put on clothing, but no one is warm enough. And he who earns wages to put it into a purse with holes. Okay, so verse 1, we talked about Darius. Darius in Daniel 11 and verse 1 is called Darius the Mede. He reigned from 522 to 486. So we see in verse 1 that it was in the 2nd year of his reign that Haggai and Zechariah went to work. He took over the Babylonian kingdom after the death of Belshazzar. Remember Belshazzar's death with the hand coming out and writing on the wall? And that was Belshazzar. Then came Darius later after him. When we look at the time of year, we would say the time of year in the 6th month was probably akin to our August or September, so early autumn, late summer, based on our time calendar, our calendars. God is the author of the message, very clear in verse 1. Zerubbabel is introduced here in this opening verse in this book. The name Zerubbabel means sown in Babylon. So we would assume that Zerubbabel was probably born during the Babylonian captivity. It means sown in Babylon. He was appointed as a political leader. We also introduced here to Joshua, even though we read about these in the book of Ezra. For the first time in Haggai, he's mentioned in Joshua. Joshua is the spiritual leader. So you got Zerubbabel, the political leader. You got Joshua, the spiritual leader. Joshua means Jehovah is salvation. Yeshua. Jehovah is salvation. And if you reference 1 Chronicles 6 and verse 15, you'll find that Joshua's father had been among those who had been carried off into Babylon. So again, we would find him most likely to have been born during Babylonian captivity as well. Now look at verse 2. There's a very subtle usage of a term here, but it's very powerful when you think about it. This is something that Jesus did when he was here in the flesh, when he was addressing the Jews of his day, the Jewish leaders of his day. Look in verse 2. Now, I'm not going to go back to the King James. Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, here's the word I want you to say, this people. What's different about that? What would you expect it to say instead of this people? You would think it would say my people, because these are God's people. Okay? Just like Jesus said later on, again, when he was here in the flesh, he talked about the temple, and he said, this house instead of my house. What's the significance of that? Remember when we talked about Hosea and the different children that were born to his wife Gomer, and how each one had a different, one of the meanings was not my people. So what's the significance? Just with that very one single term, what is God trying to get across? This people say.
It's almost like saying in a way that mine is basically personal. Mine meaning you belong to me.
Okay.
But by saying this is almost like saying you basically own your own.
Okay.
It still separates them out, though.
It does. But could it also be, and I'm going with that, Tony, could it be in conjunction with that God might even go so far as to say, my people wouldn't do this.
Right.
This people,
Right.
this generation, right. This one I'm looking at, this people, you're saying, and now let's look at what they're going to be saying. Okay. The time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. What are they presuming to do at this point? God said, go back and rebuild, right? The people said, it's not time. Now, why were they saying it wasn't time? Back to what Rich said earlier. From the fear, okay? So their fear led them to make up God's rules for them. Is that what they're doing? God doesn't want us to know. God doesn't want us to do this right now. It's not time for us to build the Lord's house. He'll let us know when it's time. Wait a minute. He did let you know when it's time. He let you know 15 years ago it was time. But you see, when out of fear, what that prompts us, or we allow it to do to us, we allow it to change God's word. Well, God didn't really mean that. Now, I know that's what the Bible says, but that's not really what God meant. That's exactly what they're doing here. We know that's what God says, but he didn't mean that. It's not time yet.
Yeah, that's where 1:1 actually says that God stirred up the spirit of Cyrus to give that proclamation. It definitely was God through Cyrus giving that proclamation for them to do so.
Very true. And could that be also why there's so much emphasis on who is giving this message in Haggai? Why he keeps saying over and over and over again the name Jehovah, so that they remember who this is coming from. So the people say the time has not come, the time of the Lord's house should not be built. Now, I'm going to throw this out there. It seems to me the real problem, yes, it was fear, but their fear had led to their indifference and their laziness. And I'm going to expound on that as we go on here in just a little bit. In essence, this statement, it's not time, this was an excuse. So why aren't you doing anything, Judah? Well, God doesn't want me to. Okay? Well, God's about to change or speak to that very issue in just a moment. In essence, their attitude was a convenient way for them to keep from having to work and to keep from having to stand up against the opposition. David Smith in the Beacon Bible Commentary said, at root, however, the community's objection to rebuilding was not due to selfishness. They were preoccupied with personal matters to the neglect of larger issues of importance to the whole community. In short, they had placed themselves before God. Okay, there's a progression or a digression, would be a better phrase to use here. All right, it started with their fear back so many years earlier. Their fear had led to their indifference. Their indifference led to their materialism, as we're going to see next. Okay, they became indifferent about serving God. Well, you're going to serve somebody, right? Matthew 6 and verse 24, no man can serve two masters, either love the one, hate the other, he'll cling to one, despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. We're going to serve one or the other, whether we want to or not. Or whether, excuse me, not whether we want to, but whether we think we are or not. If we're not serving God, who are we serving? Who's on the other end of the spectrum? Okay, we're serving Satan if we're not serving God. Even if we're not doing anything, if we think we're safe, but well, I'm just going to sit around here and do nothing. Well, Matthew chapter 25 deals with the subject of those who in judgment will stand before God having done nothing. And how God will cast them out because they didn't do anything. Okay, so doing nothing is the equivalent of following Satan. Okay, so
The one who buried the talent.
the one who buried the talent, Matthew 25, exactly. Okay, so now verses 3 and 4. Verse 4, is it time for you to dwell in your sealed, or the New American said, panel houses, and this house lie in waste? So during the 15-year in which the period, 15-year period in which the temple was left alone, the Jews were not just sitting around, but instead, what were they doing?
Bringing prosperity to themselves.
They were building them some mighty nice houses, weren't they? Okay. How many of them might have walked by that temple foundation on a daily basis, carrying their lumber and their doorknobs and their whatever else they did to build their houses, and not giving a second thought to it, or just passing by and saying, we'll get to you, but I'm too busy building my house right now, we'll get to you. They had put their own desires before God's will. They had plenty of time and commitment to take care of their physical needs, but they would not put forth the effort to do the will of God, namely rebuild the temple. Now, there's a whole month of sermons just in these first few verses right here. Okay?
Just thinking along, this path we're going, but the fact that, Cyrus sent them there, he backed them, and once they got there, they didn't go back, they just stayed.
Yeah.
It's just curious to me that the king, if truly they were troublemakers, why he didn't put them back into wherever they were before they went to Jerusalem. Because he would have wanted to break them up so they wouldn't cause trouble. That's curious.
Well, it seems like they, especially during this 15-year period, they were so afraid and cowed. He figured, okay, I got you under my thumb. So he's just content to let them stay there, maybe. He wasn't worried about it. Okay, so again, back to verses 3 and 4. Notice the contrast. Again, the King James uses the word sealed house. The New American Standard says panel house. The word translated sealed has reference to a house that is ornately decorated, indicative of luxurious living. So let's go to another step here. Not only were they neglecting God's temple, not only were they building their own houses, but they were making them really fancy. So they had the money, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were using it for their own goods.
Wasn't this a complaint that David had about the fact that, they were living in fine houses, but the Lord's place of worship was in shambles?
Yeah, that's a good point.
A whole different, different phase.
Right, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. But it shows clearly where their priorities had been misplaced. Verses 5 and 6, the charge of verse 5 is repeated 2 verses later, where he says to consider your ways. And we talked about the different translations of that. Basically, it means set your heart upon your ways. In other words, you need to stop and think. Okay? Do we get into trouble sometimes because we don't think? It never happens, right? We do, because if we would stop and meditate and think about it before we make a decision or take an action, we might make a better decision. Well, that's what he's telling them to do. Consider your ways, think about what you're doing. You need to examine the situation. And so here's some things that they should have considered. Continuing on in verse 6. They had been putting material things first. They had been putting the building of their fancy houses first and foremost. What did they get from all that? Verse 6. What does it look like is happening through this time? Israel, or Judah rather, is putting themselves first and neglecting the work of God. What picture do you see from verse 6? Would you say that they were really doing great? What's happening? You've sown much, but what? Okay.
I think they're starting at the end, they're never satisfied.
Okay. And then that phrase, the last phrase, which we probably know from being able to quote it, again, King James, he that earneth wages to put it into a bag with holes. What does that mean? Yeah. I mean, you got a hole in your pocket. You know, you got $1 million in your wallet.
You put $1 million in, but it doesn't stay there.
It doesn't stay there. You put it in your pocket, and you got a big old hole in it, and you don't get the benefit. You've had the $1 million. You got nothing from it because it's gone. Okay. So that's his point. He's going to talk about that again in verse 9. Okay. Again, verse 7. Let's read verses 7 through 11. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the mountain and bring wood and build the house. I'll take pleasure in it, and I will be glorified, saith the Lord. You looked for much, and lo, it came to little. When you brought it home, I blew upon it. Why, says the Lord of hosts? Because my house it is waste, and you run every man to his own house. Therefore the heaven over you is stayed from dew, and the earth is stayed from her fruit. And I call for a drought upon the land, and upon the mountains, and upon the corn, and upon the new wine, and upon the oil, and upon that which the ground bringeth forth, and upon men, and upon cattle, and upon all the labor of the hands. Okay, verse 7. Again, he says, consider your ways. Think about what you're doing. Focus on this here. Verse 8. Do what God says. Do what I say, and I'll be pleased. In doing what I say, God says, who will be glorified? God says, do what I say, and who will be glorified? He will be glorified. Because who were they glorifying? The king. They were glorifying the king because they put his will above God's will. They were glorifying themselves and building up these, fancy houses for themselves. God said, put me first and glorify me, and I'll be pleased. This, as President Bush said, this isn't rocket surgery. Okay? This is not that difficult to understand. I don't know. Somebody said he did, so we'll borrow it and say, I don't know if he did or not. Okay, so still in verses 9 through 11, back to verses 9 through 11. Verse 9, more about the suffering they'd experienced because of putting their pleasure above God's work. Notice the emphasis. Who is saying this? Jehovah of hosts, the Lord of hosts. When you brought it home, you looked for much, you got little. When you brought it home, I blew upon it. I blew it away. The Lord of hosts said this. Why? Because my house is lying waste. But there's another key phrase in here. Okay? This is just a wealth of powerful lessons here. Okay? Not only were they neglecting the work of God by not rebuilding the temple, not only were they building their own houses to the neglect of the temple, not only were they building themselves in incredibly gorgeous, ornate houses to the neglect of God's temple, but verse 9 says, God's house was in waste, and you run every man to his own house. So they were determined. They had a focus on taking care of themselves and totally neglecting what God wanted them to do. They were consumed They ran to it. They were consumed with satisfying their own desires.
Doesn't it also sound there as well like they placed their security in their own house?
Okay.
So when things go wrong, where do they go?
Run to the house. Yeah, place of security in it. Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. So they were building their houses, doing it with a great zeal, hotly pursuing material comfort, running to the material things. Calder said this, the commentator. He said, when the house of Jehovah was in question, they did not move from the spot, but if it concerned their own house, they ran. And God makes it very clear in these verses that he was the cause of their lack. It was not some coincidence. Just some cross references if you want to put them down. Again, they'll be in your notes if you don't get these. But Leviticus 26:19 through 20. We won't take the time to read these, but these are some warnings that God had given through Moses centuries earlier. What was going to happen if they turned away from God? Leviticus 26:19 through 20. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 17 is another one. Deuteronomy 11:17. And then Deuteronomy 28, verses 23 through 24. Again, these are warnings that have been given centuries earlier about not seeking God first. The last one, again, was Deuteronomy 28, 23 through 24. All right, let's finish this chapter and then we'll take a break. Verses 12 through 15. Then Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Joshua the son of Josedek, the high priest, with all the remnant of the people, obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the words of Haggai the prophet, as the Lord their God had sent him, and the people did fear before the Lord. Then spake Haggai the Lord's messenger, and the Lord's message unto the people, saying, I am with you, saith the Lord. And the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua the son of Josedek, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people. And they came and did work in the house of the Lord of hosts their God, in the 24th day of the 6th month, in the 2nd year of Darius the king. So the preaching produced the desired effect of repentance. The people obeyed and feared the Lord, verse 12, and they got to work. Well, now let's notice a couple of things. First of all, let's notice that the preaching was directed, first of all, to the leaders, who were the ones who led the people back to the rebuilding of the temple. Other than that, Haggai and Zechariah. The leaders, Zerubbabel and Joshua, the political leader, the spiritual leader. That's who they addressed first. Okay? Also in these verses, notice the emphasis on whose word was being spoken. Look in verse 12. The voice of the Lord their God, the words of Haggai the prophet, as the Lord God had sent him. Their God. Kaufman says this, he says the double reference in this verse to the word of Jehovah and the word of Haggai the prophet is for the purpose of showing that the voice of the Lord and the words of Haggai the prophet are identical. This is true prophecy. And again, there's an emphasis. Now look in verse 13. From the King James Version, we'll bring some other versions in here too, to see what they say. Verse 13. Then spake Haggai, the Lord's messenger, in the Lord's message, I am with you, thus saith the Lord. Whose message is it? What do you think from verse 13? Whose message is this? Is it one Haggai made up? Okay, what do we got for a different version there? Verse 13. You got?
Spoke by the commission, Lord.
Okay. Do they all emphasize that? I mean, this is the New American Standard. It says, Haggai, the messenger of the Lord, spoke by the commission of the Lord to the people saying, I'm with you, declares the Lord. The Lord. Okay. Is that overkill? Or is it necessary? It's obviously necessary. Okay.
It's interesting that they went to such trouble to explain that it really was the Lord speaking to him. It says, he's a prophet of the Lord, he was commissioned by the Lord, and he said, this says the Lord. It's kind of like, Paul goes into great detail, he's an apostle. Well, for some reason,
Yeah.
and make perfectly sure.
Yeah. Well, and again, part of that could be there could have been false prophets. They had to distinguish. And then part of it could be that the people have just kind of forgotten about who Jehovah is. And by the way, this is not Haggai saying this. This is a message from God. We're going to talk about that in chapter 2 a little bit too. He's going to make it very clear What happened to you, God's going to make it very clear what's happened to you, the punishment you received, it was not coincidental. It didn't just happen. I made it happen. All right, so verse 14, the word stirred up, talks about stirring up Zerubbabel and Joshua. The word stirred up means to rouse oneself, to awaken, or to incite. Another lexicon defines that word as to be hot, to be alert, and to be watchful.
King James said he stirred them all up.
Stir them all up.
High priest and all the
The high priest, okay, yes, the spirit of all the remnant of people. But it started with Zerubbabel and Joshua. It started at the top. And they got stirred up. What'd they do? They got excited.
like working.
We're gonna get this done. Now, when they did that, I'm getting ahead of myself. When they did that, in Ezra's account of what's going on in Ezra 5 and verse 8, the King James says, this work goes fast on and prospereth in their hands. So they got excited, and all of a sudden, they were really putting together a building. They were really making some headway in their progress there. Once the people recommitted themselves to the work, they did it with all their might. What they had lacked was commitment. Indifference, which is what they had, destroys commitment, which in turn destroys work. When one is committed to doing God's will, he's able to accomplish many things. And then, folks, look at this. At the end of the chapter, chapter 1, there were just 23 days between the time that Haggai first brought his message and the time that the people repented. According to Ezra 6 and verse 15, the temple was finished just 4 years later. That may seem like a long time to us, but I don't think they had a lot of the technology that we have today. I think 4 years for an edifice of that size is quite impressive. But again, I go back to Ezra 5 verse 8. The work started getting done fast. Isn't this a great chapter just to look at, to give a lesson either in a Bible class or a ladies class or a sermon sometime? Just, to get up and get going, how easy it is to get distracted by diversions in this world, and how important God still wants us, how important it is to remember that God still wants us to put Him first. That's a lot of material. Good stuff.
And sometimes the task can seem huge and daunting because of the enormity of it.
Mm-hmm.
But again, because they were inspired to start up and get going, they just jumped in and just started.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting, just kind of in conjunction with that God allowed two men to work together, Haggai and Zechariah. Just like when Jesus initially sent out the 70, they sent them out in pairs. Isn't it interesting?
Well, they went and mixed church and state, though.
That's during a theocracy, that works. Okay. But again, the two, we're talking about the pair, Haggai and Zechariah coming together. So who are the two, again, the number two, who led the people back, who listened? Zerubbabel and Joshua. So again, God used a pair. God used that two, that, two are better than one. As Proverbs, Solomon talked about the two, how we help each other. So God saw the need for this teamwork, and it encouraged the people to get back to work. Again, you talk about some good things to consider for a study, or encouraging Christians today to get to work.
When they say Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, is it saying that Joshua is the son of the high priest?
Yeah,
Or the high priest is the
governor of Judah, the spirit of Joshua, the son of Josadak. Now, I think, I'm trying to remember, we were introduced to Joshua. Oh, let's see. Back in 1 Chronicles 6:15, let me look there really quick. Joshua was the high priest. Now, whether his father was, I don't think it tells us. No, it just says Jehozadak went into captivity from the Lord through. So no, Joshua is the high priest. But it doesn't say whether his father was or not. Good question. Any other questions, comments on chapter 1? Okay, I have got 7:55, just turned 7:56. Why don't we take about a 10-minute break and see where we're at? Everybody get up and stretch. Some drinks and chips and sugary stuff over there. Because we're not going to get enough of that in December, so you need to get some more tonight.
What is the chance that the things, the materials they're running to their houses with and building their ornate houses with are actually materials that they make for the temple?
I knew exactly where you were going with that. And I wondered that too. Because, let's see, I'm trying to remember.
Well, I mean, it brings it up with a lot of force.
Yeah.
The ornate housing.
I wonder, they didn't have drywall like we have, or things like these. I wonder what their panels were. Wood maybe?
See, because like in Ezra 6, where Cyrus says, let the house be built, the place where they offered sacrifices, let the foundations thereof be strongly laid, the height thereof 80 cubits, the breadth thereof 80 cubits, stones and a row of new timbers, let the expenses be given out of the king's house. Okay, now this was during Darius' time, but if Cyrus did the same thing, then, I wondered that too. Were they taking, because I mean, they weren't using, so maybe they had, maybe somebody said, look at all these stones and
I mean,
timber.
if they just leave it there, it's being
Yeah.
stolen by those Samaritans.
Yeah, it's very
That's right.
possible.
The king gave them resources. Is that what you were just reading?
Yeah.
Yeah, so,
So they very well could have been
yeah,
reappropriating, is that a good way to say it? Or
Yeah.
misappropriating,
and I can see how that would make the, like,
not too happy.
perturbed.
Yeah. So you
I'm
giving
gonna
up?
attempt my first trip to the office tomorrow.
Oh, good. You gonna be able to work?
Jody's we're gonna drop Rebecca off and then she's gonna run me over to the office.
Okay.
And then probably noon or so, she'll pick me up and get me back at home. And then that'll be her, I can get her.
You can go right back home, right? You should text them. Not a bad deal.
I invited her to come to the class.
Okay. I think it's the most we've had online here, so we've got a number of online students from different parts of the state. About one from Alabama, ready now.
Wow.
From all over the place.
Good.
Yeah.
It's doing well.
Get from here, from all over the-
And after, as soon as we finish the class tonight, we'll be ready to mall and we'll walk the mall.
Oh, good.
Trying to get, just love meetings.
Is that still open?
There, a lot of the stores are open till 10 now, so we should be able to, park outside the main entrance and
Do they keep it open just so you can come out and walk around?
they open, I don't know that they do it just so that you can go and work around, but they do have walking clubs.
Yeah, because the malls I'm familiar with, like this one's small, but I know they often open the doors at like 7, 8 o'clock.
I'm not sure what time Mall of Georgia opens their doors, but it is early. It may not be 7 or 8, but it's at least a couple hours before the store starts opening, which is like 10 o'clock on a regular day, I think. But
That's nice that they have a code down. It's nice that you can walk in.
if you do all the alcoves in the lower level and all the alcoves in the upper level, I think it's 2 miles.
Okay.
I'm not doing 2 miles. but-
Yeah, well, that's good to get some workout though, that's a good idea. I went out and ran this morning, but come Friday morning this week, I think it's supposed to be in the 20s. I'm sure I'll go back and work.
I for them all.
Yeah,
Of course, you're not gonna be jogging at the mall.
they probably won't want to see a guy running around.
Certain speeds, I'm sure, are considered acceptable.
They might raise a red flag or two.
Have a brigade of segways behind.
Yeah.
I just started doing PT, self-PT, Friday.
Maybe it's so many days a week that you're supposed to do that.
Every day, twice a day, 10 reps of several exercises.
Well, that or is it?
Well, it's passive, so I have to do all the work with my other arm. I'm not supposed to exert any muscular effort.
What is the purpose of doing what the opposite arm?
Well, I mean, it's the movement is to keep it from locking up.
Okay.
It's not really to build up any strength. It's just to go through the range of motion. And I probably won't be able to get much range of motion in the first few days anyway, because the painful. They have me doing it instead of a PT therapist, because he's had experience with the physical therapist actually going a little harder, and it had negative impact. So he wants Dr. Stokes, his patient doing the lifting, so that as soon as they feel that uncomfortable pain, they just stop. It's supposed to, for the next month, it's not no pain, no gain. It's as soon as you get pain, you stop. But I just looked at the PA when she was telling me what to do, and I said, I'm going to have to get inventive. I can't do those passive exercises you're talking about because this shoulder's messed up too. It doesn't have the lifting strength to get this elbow, reach across and get this elbow up to shoulder height. So I've got this little pulley thing at the house that Wayne Johnson gave me, and I'll probably rig it up and figure out a way to use that for lifting. I mean, it's no more dangerous because as soon as I get pain, I stop. It's just this arm can pull down a lot easier than pushing that.
Yeah. Make me think of that episode of Andy Griffith where Barnes trying to stretch himself. You seen that?
Stretch his
They
neck
put
out.
a sling around his neck and hook him up in the closet.
They're trying to make him taller.
They're trying to make him an inch taller, yeah. So,
To meet the deputy requirements that have
there
been.
you go. See, she's been around me long enough, she can quote Andy Griffith.
Picking it up.
Yeah, I like it.
Well, I've seen it a few times now.
Just a few.
Well, I saw the gym neighbor stuff going around last week.
Yeah, I put one up.
He lived a long time.
87 years old. Yeah. All right, well, let's just jump right on back into Haggai, chapter 2. Everybody's ready to go again? We won't finish Zechariah quite so quickly. Zechariah is going to take us about 5 weeks. Okay, Haggai, chapter 2, verses 1 through 9 is the second section. The central message of the second section is, that's a lot of S's, don't be discouraged. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. Don't be discouraged. So let's read those verses. In the 7th month, in the 21st day of the month, came the word of the Lord by the prophet Haggai, saying, Speak now to Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Josedek, the high priest, and to the residue of the people, saying, Who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory? And how do you see it now? Is it not in your eyes? In comparison of it is nothing? Yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, saith the Lord, and be strong, O Joshua son of Josedek, the high priest. And be strong, all you people of the land, saith the Lord, and work, for I am with you, saith the Lord of hosts. According to the word that I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, so my spirit remaineth among you, fear ye not. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once it is a little while, and I will shake the heavens, and the earth, and the sea, and the dry land. And I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, saith the Lord of hosts. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than of the former, saith the Lord of hosts, and in this place will I give peace, saith the Lord of hosts. Just reading those verses. All right, spoiler alert. How can that not be messianic? I mean, what possibly could anybody have done in a physical sense, in a physical temple, that would have God saying, I am going to bring the greatness the glory to this place. Anyway, okay, spoiler alert, everybody knows what we're going to talk about now. All right, so this message came about 2 months later, as we see in verse 1. Again, if we look at our calendar, it would be the equivalent of our October or November. It also came at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles. If you go back to Leviticus 23 and verse 34, you find when the Feast of Tabernacles was to begin, and it was about 7 days prior to this message of Haggai in chapter 2. Verses 2 and 3 states the problem. The problem is this. The older men who had seen the glorious state of the temple in its original state were discouraged because the rebuilt temple was not as great as the original. Remember, we talked about that back in Ezra chapter 3 when they laid the foundation, and how that some of them shouted out for joy and some of them cried. And in verse 13 says that they couldn't distinguish from a distance, they couldn't distinguish between the crying and the cheering, because both were so loud. They considered this version of the temple, as we see in verse 3, to be nothing in comparison to the original. Going to the New American Standard in verse 3, who is left among you who saw this temple in its former glory? And now how do you see it? Does it not seem to you like nothing in comparison? Okay, we understand that, right? We understand. So to understand more fully why they would have been discouraged, first of all, the thought of the place where God had once met, quote unquote, with the high priest, and now that was gone. A little bit more about this. Think about the glory of the Temple of Solomon. It was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, 45 feet high, and that's not counting the various porches and chambers attached to it. We don't have to look all these up now. These will be in your notes to reference. Have you ever looked at how much of that was just covered with gold? I mean, gold today is worth some odd $1,000 per ounce. The value of a precious metal is determined by its scarcity, its rarity. But in that day, it said, I think it's in 2 chapter 1, where it says silver was like stone. It wasn't counted anything because there was so much of it. And the gold was the same way. There was just so much of it. It did not have a value of scarcity to it. But get this picture in our minds of what this place must have looked like. Burton Kaufman in his commentary said some have estimated, by the way, Kaufman wrote his commentary in the middle 60s. Some have estimated the cost of Solomon's temple somewhere between $3 and $5 billion. Now, he wrote that 50 years ago. So you bring that in, you bring the fact, remember all the gorgeous tapestry, remember all the crafters, the hand workers who were doing all the tapestry, all the precious jewels that were in this place, okay? And above all, the Ark of the Covenant was there in the most holy place. Just strictly from a physical standpoint, you can just see why these people, if their focus, as it had been, is on material things, and these had remembered, the older ones, especially, primarily the older ones had remembered what it had looked like before it started getting torn apart. They're thinking, it's not ever going to look like that again.
Well, and this is the point where it had the foundation had been started already.
Right.
So they still realize that the restored foundation wasn't nearly as nice as it should be. The
whole thing is, as it's getting put together, the whole thing. I mean, when you read, first of all, during Hezekiah's reign in 2 Kings 18 and 19, Hezekiah allowed, I think it was the Assyrian leader, to come in and look and see what he had. And then he started cutting things up. He started cutting gold off to pay off these people to keep them away. They're going up and they're attacking Israel, the northern kingdom. And Hezekiah figures, well, I guess what I need to do here is I'll start buying you off so you'll leave us alone. And then eventually the Assyrian king said, that's not enough, I'm going to take you too. And of course God intervened and they were destroyed. They were defeated, the Assyrians were. But so little bit by little bit it was being chopped apart. But when the Babylonians came in, as we read from 2 Kings, the last chapter of 2 Kings, when the Babylonians came in, they just gutted the place. I mean, what would you expect them to do? They're not going to burn all that gold down to nothing. They're going to strip it off. They're going to take it back to their place. And that's exactly what they did.
When they were building the new foundation, could the older people not have been weeping for joy, possibly?
Well, that's what, back in chapter 3 in Ezra, where he talks about this, some of them were weeping for joy, but some of them, he specifically says, were weeping because, like he says here, they had seen the former glory, and it wasn't going to be the same.
Okay, well, I'm running ahead a little bit. What about verse 9, though? How does that correlate to everything?
We'll get that. We will discuss that.
That's a spoiler.
Yeah, so I gave you a heads up to be ready for that. Okay. So yeah, let me go back to that real quick. It says that the contrast in Ezra 3 and verse 12, many of the ancient men who had seen the first house, when they saw the foundation of this house, wept, and many shouted for joy. So there's a contrast between the weeping and the joy. Some were sad and some were happy. Okay, so Judah is back, but they have less money, they have fewer resources, even though the king of Persia was going to help them out. They still didn't have as much as they had because Solomon was the wealthiest man on the face of the earth. And there was nobody who could come close to him. The older men began to look at the temple. The rebuilt temple is inferior to the original, realizing they didn't have the resources to make it look like it used to. Verses 4 through 9, God's method of encouraging them. In verse 4, he says, be strong. The word strong means to be comforted, to be inwardly strong. So be resolved. And then he tells them to get to work. And he reminds them in verse 4, I am with you. Go ahead and step out and do what you're supposed to do because I'm going to be there with you. And so he makes a great promise to them. In verses 5 through 9, he tries to get them to look ahead. So here's where we're going to talk about that now. Verse 5. God was with their forefathers. I'll be with you. Don't be afraid. Okay. He's asking them to go back into the scriptures, to the books of Moses, and remember that they had been taught and as they had read that God had been with them as they left Egypt. God keeps his promises, although we know that some of his promises are conditional. Kaufman says this, he says, in this verse is the promise that God meant all he ever said. He will yet bless the true Israel, the spiritual seed of Abraham, making them a blessing to all the earth. The fulfillment of that promise would yet come, but not in the way fleshly Israel imagined. The very next verse would point to the true method of its accomplishment. Okay. So verse 5, again, according to the word that I covenanted with you, and of course he's talking about their ancestors, when you came out of Egypt, so my spirit remaineth among you, don't be afraid, fear ye not. All right, verse 6. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once. Some versions read yet once more. I'm trying to think in verse 6. The New American Standard says once more in a little while. Okay. Perhaps he's referencing back to what he had introduced in verse 5 when he was talking about God leading them out of Egypt. So perhaps he's referencing the time when God had given the law to Moses, what happened on Mount Sinai when God gave the law to Moses. Exodus 19 and verse 18. Exodus 19 verse 18, when Moses was with God in Mount Sinai, it says, Mount Sinai was altogether smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. So when God met Moses, as it were, on Mount Sinai, there was a mighty quaking of the earth, of the land, or at least of the mountain anyway. Barnes says this, he said, by the word yet, he looks back to the first great shaking of the moral world, when God's revelation by Moses and to his people broke upon the darkness of the pagan world to be a monument against pagan error until Christ should come. So again, referencing the establishment of what we know as the law of Moses, or specifically Exodus chapter 20, the foundational principles of it, the Ten Commandments. Okay. So that's yet once perhaps referencing what happened on Mount Sinai when Moses met with God and received the Ten Commandments. Now he talks about, he uses the term a little while, yet once. It is a little while. And a little while is open-ended, doesn't necessarily indicate an immediate event. But now at the end of this, he says, I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land. And there are a lot of places you could go with that. That's exactly what he's meaning. But I'm going to let the Bible be its own inspired commentary. Because in Hebrews chapter 12, and beginning in verse 26, Hebrews 12:26, the writer says, whose voice, speaking of God, then shook the earth, but now hath he promised, saying, yet once more I shake not the earth only, but also heaven. And this word, yet once more, signifieth the removing of those things that are shaken, as the things that are made, that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. Whereby we receiving the kingdom which cannot be moved, let us have grace whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. Look at that in Hebrews 12, verse 26. He has specific reference to Haggai 1 and verse 6. Haggai 1 and verse 6, yet once it is a little while, I will shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. Hebrews 12 and verse 26, whose voice then shook the earth. Now he has promised, yet once more I shake not the earth only, but also heaven. Okay. Now, a couple of different views on that. Obviously, it's forward-looking. It's a prophecy. Is he talking about the shake-up of things when Jesus came in the flesh and when Jesus gave his life and rose from the dead? Is he talking about the final judgment? Okay.
When Jesus died on the cross, there's an earthquake.
And Jesus died, again, anything monumental, anything that marks a major turning point in history is accomplished with these great physical acts. Okay. When you read on in Hebrews 12, as we read through the end of the chapter, and he's talking about the kingdom that cannot be shaken, whose kingdom is he talking about? Which kingdom is not going to be shaken? Which kingdom can't be shaken? Christ's kingdom. Okay. Okay. As opposed to the Babylonians, what happened to them? They were shaken. The Assyrians, what happened to them? The Medo-Persians, what happened to the Romans? And what's happened to countless numbers of governments over the centuries? They've all shaken and they've fallen. But the eternal kingdom shall not be shaken.
Would you also say on that particular reference of earthquakes, would you also say that in different parts of the world right now, how we have had different earthquakes in different countries, almost like symbolic to this of saying, God is in reference of saying, my kingdom cannot be shaken, but yours can.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know that there's a specific reference, because I think what we're dealing with here is definitive God-intended shakings of the earth to demonstrate an earth-shattering, momentous event in the history of time. Okay? The giving of the law of Moses, the crucifixion of Christ, and then ultimately the taking away of everything. Now, certainly, the reminder of the frailties of our earth should cause us to remember nothing here is permanent. So for that extent, but I think something like that is more incidental than it is specifically relating to these things we're talking about here. So.
And I think it's safe to assume they knew what an earthquake was. They knew what a volcanic eruption was. And the difference between the ones that, we're brought to focus on, like, is when Christ died. The earth shook in correlation with him giving up his spirit. It was the same time thing. And it wasn't just the shaking of the earth, but it was the tearing of the temple veil and things like that. Just like with the volcanic and seismic activity that took place when Moses was up on Sinai. But obviously they even built gods around, like these events, floods, typhoons, earthquakes, all kinds of things like that. So that's a tough one. That's a tough one because people will try to do meanings to the current events that are happening on Earth right now.
Right. And again, I don't see that in here.
Right.
I think specifically he's got an event in mind. In fact, I think there are two events being spoken of in these next couple of verses. the bigger picture, now going into verse 7, the bigger picture, verse 6, I think is painting the bigger picture of the final judgment, when all kingdoms essentially are going to be taken away except for one. Okay, well, verse 6, I think, is the bigger picture. Now, verse 7, I would say, prophesies another event that's going to shake up the world, and that is the coming of the Word in the flesh. Okay, so perhaps there are two different events being spoken of. Verse 6, I think we can conclude, ties in with Hebrews 12:26 and following. But verse 7, when he says, "And I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts." Whatever verse 7 is talking about, this house is still going to be there, this temple that they're building. Because again, what's the context? The context is the people who were discouraged because they think, "Oh, this is never going to be as good as Solomon's was." And God says, "Yeah, it's going to be better. Because who's going to walk through it? Who's going to teach in the temple?"
And I had a question on that.
Okay.
Do you think that when he's talking here in 7, well, 6 and 7, but in 7, that along the Messianic line, that he's not, when he says this house, he's not referring to the temple, he's referring to the house of Judah, Israel.
Okay.
He's going to come through glory, the promise is going to come through, and that glory is going to shine. Because it seems like he says this house of glory is the Lord of hosts, but then he goes on and talks about some material things as well. Right. So.
And that's a good point, a good question to be considered. I think when we come to the end of verse 9, as we consider the next two verses, let's bring that back up and think about that. Because this might shed a little light as we consider the rest of the verses. Now, some have said verse 7 has reference to the surrounding kingdoms giving gifts to Judah, which could be used to decorate the temple. And they did receive gifts at the hands of Darius and Artaxerxes. But again, folks, I think there's a much deeper meaning here. This is messianic. And he talks the word desire, for instance, in verse 7, the desire of all nations. The word desire means goodly, pleasant, precious, that which is desirable. Now, who would that fit? Sure it would. Okay. Other versions here, other than the King James, I'm not sure what your version has. Verse 7 in the New American Standard says, "the wealth of all nations." I think that does it. Yeah, and I'm not sure that's the best translation, because that does tend to make one think, well, yeah, this is the nations donating things to get the temple rebuilt.
The New King James has desire. All the nations capitalized.
Okay.
And Harper's has a footnote that says that there is kind of a discourse, continual discourse around whether it's desire or the wealth of nations.
Yeah.
More appropriate.
And other versions say treasures. One version says the one desire. One version says precious things. Okay, so that this desire was to be something or someone greater than material treasures, in my judgment, is evident in the phrase, "I will fill this house with glory," because mere physical wealth was not going to fill the house with glory. That would not. God is way above that now. It had its physical glory. It had the gold. It had the silver, the jewels. It had the tapestry. It had all the physical glory. But guess what? That was just physical glory. God is saying there's something greater coming. If it's physical glory that he's talking about here, then how is that greater than what they already had? It's not. In fact, it's going to be far inferior to what they had, because they don't have the resources that Solomon did. Something greater, and I think that's where we need to look at this and say, look, this is way beyond the physical, material picture here. This is spiritual. Okay? Again, referring to Albert Barnes in regard to, let's go down to verse 8 now, where it says, "The silver is mine, the gold is mine, saith the Lord of hosts." Barnes says, it is as if God would say, "Think not the temple inglorious, because maybe it will have no portion of gold or silver in their splendor. I do not need such things," God says. "How should I? I own the silver. I own the gold. What I'm seeking is true worshipers, and with their brightness, I will decorate this temple." Let him come who has right faith, is adorned by graces, and gleamed with love for me, is pure in heart, poor in spirit, compassionate, and is good. These make the temple and in fact the church glorious and renowned, being glorified by Christ. You see how this is going to a whole new level. And in my judgment, I don't see how this can be something as mundane as just talking about, oh, we're going to have gold and jewels in the temple again. This goes way beyond that. Now, verse 9. The glory of the latter house shall be greater than the former. And again, I think he's talking about the literal, based on that, Rich, I think he's talking about the literal house and temple. Yeah. Because the glory of this latter house shall be greater than that of the former, saith the Lord of hosts. And the reason it's going to be greater is because the Messiah is going to walk there. And others said that this means the builders should be patient because after the gifts they received from the nations, the temple would look more glorious than it did at that time. But it still never got to its former form. Never. Okay. Also, let me throw this one in at you to consider. Consider the possibilities that verses 7 through 9 could be understood in a spiritual sense. So in this case, the house will be the church. Because in 2 Corinthians 6:16, Ephesians 2:21, the church is referred to as the temple. Okay. 2 Corinthians 6:16 and Ephesians 2:21. Adam Clark says the whole seems to be a metaphorical description of the church of Christ and of his filling it with all the excellencies of the Gentile world when the fullness of the Gentiles will be brought in, okay, which occurred in the first century. Okay. Side note, this is in my notes. I hope I'm not getting too far ahead. But this is not my notes, but I would like you to make a cross-reference in there to Romans chapter 9. And this is verses 6 through 8. And I've got a reason for reading this, and I'll tell you what it is after we read it. This is Romans 9, 6 through 8. He says, not as though the word of God has taken none effect, for they are not all Israel, which are of Israel. That sounds kind of cryptic on the surface. Let's read on. Neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children, but in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. The reason I brought that in is to show God, the Spirit, inspiring his writers, using the term Israel, not just in a physical sense, but also in a spiritual sense. They are not all Israel, which are of Israel. What does that mean? They are not all, just because they're in physical Israel does not mean they're a part of spiritual Israel. Who's part of spiritual Israel? From Christ Church. The promise was made to Abraham. More specifically, which of Abraham's sons was that promise fulfilled? Was it Ishmael? It was Isaac. See, he does it in Galatians chapter 5 too. He breaks it down. Okay? He wants them to understand that there is a spiritual Israel, and it is the church, or the temple of God, as you wish to call it. But there's a distinction. And so in Romans and in Galatians 2, he's reminding them, just because you're physically Jews doesn't mean that you're going to go to heaven. He's saying that in the first century after the gospel has been preached and the church has been established, of course. So I bring that in because it is possible, especially in verses 7 through 9, that this is spiritually speaking of the spiritual house of the church. Just some food for thought. I'm not dogmatically saying it is. I'm just giving you something to think about. Okay. Questions, comments on anything we've said as we get in the home stretch here?
I think there's a New Testament reference to all those who are basically followers of Christ or Abraham's seed. Mm-hmm. To go along with what you were saying.
In Galatians 4.
Adoption thing too.
Yeah, Galatians 4, he talks about us being adopted. He talks about the free woman and the bondwoman. That we're, as Christians, we're children of the free woman, not the bondwoman. Okay.
And back to the desire of all nations theme that we were talking about, it kept running through my head. I know there's a famous musical composition, and I had to Google it, but yeah, there was a famous song written by Bach. Jesu, joy of man's desire.
Yeah.
So I think it must have been pulled from this
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
as well. And one more thing I was gonna throw out there, and then I'll be quiet. Talking about the glory in the temple and all of that, it makes me think back to that Ark of the Covenant. The top of it was referred to as the mercy seat. And then there's passage in the New Testament that directly refers to Jesus as the mercy seat. And of course, there's a lot of correlations and intercorrelations, obviously.
We go to the Father through him. Yeah, Christ. Good point. All right, let's get to verses 10 through 19, the third section. Blessings for inward change is the theme. Blessings for inward change. This message was, according to verse 10, delivered 2 months after the second one. It would be equivalent to probably about our November or December. That's in verse 10. Let's look in verse, let's just read through here. Verse 10, in the 24th day of the 9th month, in the second year of Darius, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, ask now the priests concerning the law, saying, If one bear holy flesh in the skirt of his garment, and with his skirt do touch bread or pottage or wine or oil or any meat, shall it be holy? The priest answered and said, No. Then said Haggai, If one that is unclean by a dead body touch any of these, shall it be unclean? The priest had answered and said, It shall be unclean. Then answered Haggai and said, So is this people, and so is this nation before me, saith the Lord, and so is every work of their hands, and that which they offer there is unclean. Now I pray you consider from this day and upward, from before a stone was laid upon a stone in the temple of the Lord, since those days were when one came to a heap of 20 measures, there were but 10. When one came to the press fat to draw out 50 vessels out of the press, there were but 20. I smote you with blasting and with mildew and with hail and all the labors of your hands, yet you turn not to me, saith the Lord. Consider now from this day and upward, from the 24th day of the month, 9th month, even from the day that the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid, consider it. Is the seed yet in the barn? Yet, yea, is yet the vine and the fig tree and the pomegranate and the olive tree hath not brought forth? From this day will I bless you. Verses 11 through 13. Verse 11 is verse 13 rather, is referencing Numbers 19:11 regarding the unclean individual. Synopsis of what we've got here in these rather challenging passages. I would suggest the synopsis is this. God is telling them that just because they were in a holy land blessed by God did not automatically mean that they would be blessed. They must be holy themselves. God had brought them back. God had blessed them in allowing them to come back. They forgot him for a period of time and left his work alone. That didn't mean that they were sanctified in the eyes of God and pleasing to God just because they were in the land that God had promised he would return them to. Does everybody see where we're going with this? What did God expect? Did God say, okay, I'm bringing you back to Judah. I'm going to give you your land back. Do whatever you want to when you're there. It doesn't matter. You don't have to obey me. Is that what God said? They were in a land God had blessed them with. Did that automatically make them right in the eyes of God? Okay. I think that's the overall meaning of what he's about to say here. So here's the correlations that he gives. If you don't mind, I'm going to read a little bit here because these are statements that were said better than I could say. This is from Kyle and Delich commentary. The nation, in its attitude toward the Lord, resembles, on the one hand, a man who carries holy flesh in his garment, and on the other hand, a man who has become unclean through touching a corpse. Israel also possesses a sanctuary in the midst of its land, namely the place which Jehovah has chosen for his own abode and favored with many glorious promises. But now, here it is. Just as no kind of food, neither bread nor vegetables, neither wine nor oil, is sanctified by the fact that a man touches it with his sanctified garment, so will all this not be rendered holy by the fact that it is planted in the soil of the land which surrounds and encloses the sanctuary of Jehovah. For though the land itself becomes a holy land in consequence, it cannot spread this holiness any further, nor communicate it to what grows upon it. All that Israel raises on its holy land, whether corn, wine, or oil, remains unholy or common. No special blessing rests upon the fruits of this land on account of the holiness of the land itself, so as of necessity to produce fruitfulness as its result. For Israel is utterly unclean on account of its neglect of the house of Jehovah, like a man who has become unclean through touching a corpse. Everything that Israel takes hold of or upon which it lays its hand, everything that it plants and cultivates is from the very first affected with the curse of uncleanness. Okay. So the other half of this, on one hand, again, you've got two hands going here, right? Okay, so on one hand, just because you're in the Holy Land, the land that God promised, and the term Holy Land is not used correctly today, but we'll call it that at the time, that the land that God promised he would return them to. Just because you're in the land that I promised you doesn't automatically make you holy. However, on the other hand, if you do evil, then you're held accountable for that evil. Okay. So it's back to that thing about doing nothing. Remember, what was the main problem? What did Haggai start out with? What were they doing?
Lazy.
Nothing. This brings it right back. Okay. You're in the land of promise now. And you're thinking that just because you're there, you can do whatever you want to. But it doesn't work like that. And if you do evil, you're going to be accountable for the evil that you do. Okay. This is from Kaufman. He said, Haggai's application of this principle to the returned Israelites were this: number one, they had erected an altar to God on the old location and had begun to build the temple. This was allowed to be holiness. Did that automatically entitle the whole people and the entire land to be counted holy? Despite that, it appears that many were expecting God to bless them far more than had been evident in the scanty harvests and hard times through which they were passing. The reason the people had not really become holy through the token beginning they had made. Israel, in the sense of the whole nation, was utterly unclean on account of its neglect of the house of the Lord, like a man who has become unclean through touching a corpse. This uncleanness would not be easily removed, and therefore the people must not complain of hard times and inconveniences. When they do better, God will bless them. So they thought, we're back. It's all just going to flow to us. No problem. We can do whatever we want to, or nothing at all. God says, no, it doesn't work like that. Okay.
You know, it's interesting that, looking forward into the New Testament on the same thing, is Christ needs to remind us the same thing is, just because you call me Christ doesn't mean that I'm with you. No.
Call me Lord, Lord, don't do what I say.
Same concept, it's just they're doing it around righteousness of the temple, we do it around righteousness of Christ.
Right, good point.
I'm trying to look into their mindset, possibly. I don't know. They come out of 70 years of bondage, so they were basically, most of them enslaved, I would imagine, doing some fairly hard labor. Daniel and his buddies were the lucky ones who were chosen out of that to not necessarily do that kind of hard labor, but when they come out of that and travel all the way back over to Jerusalem, I imagine some of them really felt in their own minds somewhat justified in taking a break.
Yeah.
And that break turned into 15 years.
15 years. Well, and that's, I think, when you go back to the early part of chapter 1, where they were saying, it's not time. It's not time to build God's house. We tried 15 years ago, and we got shut down, so we're just going to quit. Now, that's a good excuse for them not to do anything anymore.
Well, that really falls, it really falls on the leadership.
Right.
Those leaders that came back were the ones that bowed down to the king and didn't keep the people going. People are followers. They're sheep, just like we're sheep.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that's why it seems like he addressed Zerubbabel and Joshua, the two leaders of the day. So, and I will only add one thing to what you said, Emily, that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were blessed because of their faithfulness to God. Other than,
Right.
It just so happened that they got better advantage. No, it's because of their faithfulness. So, all right, so verse 14, again, Kaufman, he says, Haggai applies the analogy we've already discussed in the previous verses. Yes, the altar they had erected upon the original site was holy, but the sinful nation was unholy. Therefore, the very sacrifices they offered were themselves unholy through contamination by contact with the sinful nation. The sinful nation would have to make some changes before blessings would be bestowed. Verse 15, there's that word again. Consider. So God is essence in saying in verse 15, from this point on, again, from before a stone was laid upon a stone in the temple, from this point on, I want you to think about what happened to you during the years in which you neglected the rebuilding of the temple, and don't forget what happened. Because we're really good, mankind is really good about forgetting where we used to be. Are we not? Okay. Don't forget what happened. Verse 16 through verse 18. What they had suffered as a result of their disobedience is in these verses, verse 16 and verse 17. Their expectations were not met. God did still provide for them, though, didn't he? He still gave them something. He was still taking care of them, but they didn't get what they thought they were going to get. They had destructive winds, mildew, and hail. God brought these troubles as punishment. They were not coincidental. You brought them on yourselves through your disobedience. Think about it. Don't forget it. Now, verse 19. Well, go back to verse 18 too. But verse 19 ties in with that. Basically, God is saying, I want you to mark this particular day. This is the day, because the Jews, as we're going to see when we get to Zechariah, they liked to make up holy days and fast days and so on, feast days and so on. They like to create them. They had created some fast days, and Zechariah is going to talk about that in chapter 4, I believe, or maybe a little bit later than that, but he's going to talk about them and their fast days that they had created. Yeah, that's in chapter 7 of Zechariah. And, they had created the fast days in commemoration of them being carried away into Babylonian captivity. And so they were good at creating their own holidays, as it were, that God did not authorize. So God says, this particular day is one I want you to remember. Because when did things start changing for you, Judah? When did you stop having your crops beaten down? When did you stop receiving half of what you expected? And the answer is the day that you started doing what I said to do in the first place. Okay. So, verse 19, God wanted them to see the direct correlation between their disobedience and suffering and their obedience and blessing as it specifically regarded the matter of rebuilding the temple. Due to the time of year, even though they could not at that moment see evidence of an abundant harvest, God encouraged them to trust him that he would keep his promise to bless them. Okay, so the seed is in the barn, the vine, all those things had not yet brought forth, but God says, trust me, I will bless you. So they still had some things because, again, as he brought out, God took some away from them, but he let them have some too. But he's not telling them, here it is, November, December. He's not saying go outside and looking, all of a sudden you're going to see all your crops boom, suddenly pop up out of the ground. He said, you got to trust me. And when it comes harvest or seed time, go out and sow your seed and you'll see what I do. And when you sow that seed and it comes up in abundance like you thought it should before, and it does, then you remember the reason it came in abundance is because you followed me and I blessed you. Okay. Fourth section, final one, chapter 2, verses 20 through 23. The central message, God uses the faithful. God uses the faithful. Verse 20, again, the word of the Lord came unto Haggai in the 24th day of the month. That's the same day as the previous message. Speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I will shake the heavens and the earth. I will overthrow the throne of kingdoms, and I will destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the heathen. I will overthrow the chariots and those that ride in them, and the horses and their riders shall come down every one by the sword of his brother. In that day, saith the Lord of hosts, will I take thee, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, saith the Lord, and will make thee a signet, as a signet, for I have chosen thee, saith the Lord of hosts. Okay. I know folks like to look at a passage like that and like to picture, I know Jewish folks like to do this, and they like to imagine that God is going to come back and he's going to wipe out all the other kingdoms and bring Judaism back into world power. Okay. It's way beyond that. Way beyond. It's way above that. The whole book is way above that. Just based on what we've said so far, we conclude in the context with the fact that, first of all, no physical force has any power against God, but in the spiritual kingdom will, if he's talking figuratively here, the spiritual kingdom will indeed destroy all earthly challengers. No kingdom, no physical kingdom can stand up to the spiritual kingdom. That doesn't indicate a physical war. Isaiah's prophecy in Isaiah chapter 2, that they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, because in the spiritual kingdom, what are our weapons? What do we have for weapons? The sword of the Spirit, Ephesians chapter 6. Yeah, Ephesians chapter 6. We have, all the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, all those things, the feet covered with the preparation of the gospel of peace. That's where we are. And we are stronger than any worldly power. If God be for us, who can be against us? Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. Spiritually, we are dominant as the kingdom of Jesus Christ. Okay. Now, verse 23. There is no indication that Zerubbabel rose to any heights of power other than that of governor. So, what does he mean? This is interesting. I'm throwing this out for your thought here. I'm still on a messianic line here. In that day, said the Lord of hosts, I will take thee, Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, I will make thee as a signet. A signet ring conferred upon its wearer the full authority and power of the giver. Okay, remember the king of the Medes and Persians, who was able to take his ring and sign something in the law, and nobody could change that law? What did Pharaoh give to Joseph? Give him his ring. Okay, so the ring indicated authority. Okay. The signet, again, read that again. The signet ring conferred upon its wearer the full authority and power of the giver. Kaufman says this is a pledge of the absolute authority and power of Jesus Christ. What we have being painted here, it looks to me, is Zerubbabel as a type of Christ, of the Messiah. Not the Messiah himself, he's not, but he's a type of the Messiah. Commentator Dean says the true Zerubbabel, Christ, the son and antitype of Zerubbabel, is the signet in the hand of the Father. Okay. Matthew chapter 1.
So you're saying kind of like Melchizedek, the high priest, was kind of like a
Type.
representation?
Okay. We're looking at Matthew chapter 1 and verse 13, verse 12, the last word in verse 12 and beginning verse 13. Whose name do you see? Okay. Zerubbabel. Yeah, I know that the King James has it a little bit different, but the New King James and the others probably say Zerubbabel, correct? Okay, same person. What does that mean in Matthew chapter 1? Whose line did Jesus come through? Of all those in the list, including Zerubbabel. Okay, so Zerubbabel was in the line of Christ. But Zerubbabel was not the king. So we've got an interesting situation here. Go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7.
Well, not to be devil's advocate, but he was in the lineage of Christ somewhat indirectly, since he's Joseph's ancestor. And Joseph was not exactly.
All depends on the tribe, right?
We're about to go on this here. 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is a promise made to David. Beginning in verse 12 through verse 14. When thy days be fulfilled and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which will proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. So the promise was made to David that a kingdom would be established. Of course, we know the kingdom was established in Solomon, but Solomon's kingdom is long gone. There's a higher picture here. Just like Genesis 49 and verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. Okay. So here's what we're looking at. Well, let me throw this one in. This is where we're going to throw a major wrinkle into this before we finish up. Look in Jeremiah chapter 22. Jeremiah 22, verses 24 through 30. As I live, saith the Lord, though Coniah the son of Jehoiakim, and Coniah is the same as Jeconiah, though Coniah the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were the signet upon my right hand, yet would I pluck thee thence. I will give thee into the hand of them that seek thy life, and into the hand of them whose face thou fearest, even into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of the Chaldeans. I will cast thee out, and thy mother that bare thee, into another country, where you were not born, there shall you die. But to the land whereunto they desire to return, thither shall they not return. Is this man Coniah a despised broken idol? Is he a vessel wherein is no pleasure? Wherefore are they cast out, he and his seed, and are cast into a land which they know not? O earth, 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 hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, write you this man childless, speaking of Coniah, a man that shall not prosper in his days, for no man of his seed shall prosper, sitting upon the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah. All right, let's tie it all together and finish up. God told David that through his lineage would come a king. God told Jeconiah, or told the people through Jeremiah, that Jeconiah, who was a descendant of David, would not have any children on the throne. That happened. Jeconiah, after Jehoiakim died, Jehoiakim took over. He was a pretty bad guy, and so Nebuchadnezzar took him, put him out of power, put his brother Zedekiah back in power. And then this is at the end of 2 Chronicles, the end of 2 Kings. And then Zedekiah, he got killed. And so eventually, was it Cyrus, I believe, who put Jeconiah back on the throne, but Jeconiah had no children. So for all intents and purposes, it looks like it stopped there. And Zerubbabel was in that lineage as well. And Zerubbabel was not a king. But because he was not a king, he was able to both continue the Davidic line and continue the fulfillment of God's prophecy regarding the earthly throne of Jerusalem. Zerubbabel is a type of Christ. Specifically, if they were looking for some kind of continuous lineage all through the years, remember in the first century, Paul told Timothy about how the Jews during his time would argue over genealogies. Remember that? He said they argue about genealogies over things that they don't know anything about. Because by that time Paul was writing that, probably a lot of the genealogies were kind of confused anyway. And certainly by the time the Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, that was pretty much all gone anyway. So Zerubbabel is a signet. He's given authority. He's given a position in the lineage of the Messiah, even though he's not a king. And it seems to me like the whole purpose of it is not to show, well, let me phrase it differently. The whole purpose of it, in my judgment, is to show that you should not be expecting a physical kingdom of Israel. Zerubbabel is a type of the spiritual king. Okay? So it's taking us away from the idea that's still prevalent among Judaism and that's still prevalent among premillennialism, that somehow Judah is going to get their kingdom back, or Israel is going to get their kingdom back on the face of this earth. I think Zerubbabel's existence indicates quite the opposite. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? I know that's, I know it's food for thought, right? But why does he have a man in the lineage of Christ who is not a king? And again, in my judgment anyway, the reason for that is to very clearly demonstrate you shouldn't be expecting a physical kingdom. You're not going to have a series of physical kings. The physical kings are done for. They're gone. They don't have any more kings from here on out, do they? You read about, during the intertestamental period, how many kings do you have? Well, when you come up, eventually you say, well, we got King Herod and so on like that, but King Herod was, appointed by who? He wasn't appointed by God. He was kind of a mixture of religions, of culture. Okay, so he wasn't from the line of David, was he? What do you think about that? It's an interesting thought, isn't it?
Well, isn't it interesting that, of course, you even talked to these today, and I have talked to them, several, and they speak on Jesus. They don't accept him as being Messiah. But isn't it interesting, just like in the study you had tonight, that, you think that the bloodline has been broken, or that, Jesus wasn't the Messiah. He wasn't, a king. He didn't come through a king's path of the lineage, but he did come from the line of David. So it's very interesting that, once the Messiah has shown himself, you can connect him all the way back. But at the time when he was on earth, he wasn't where what they expected him to be.
Right. Well, and for that matter, you just made me think of this too. Was his father a king, earthly father a king? No, he wasn't. Yeah. And you go back and look, if you read Matthew 1, and a lot of times we just kind of gloss over those genealogies, those who begat this and begat this, we don't think about it. How many of those guys after Solomon, who's really the last one mentioned, who would actually have been on the throne, the physical throne of Israel. And,
well, it actually starts coming down a priestly route, doesn't it?
We're coming from Judah, yeah. You got Manasseh, you got Josiah, you got Jeconiah.
That's the end.
Yep. That's it. And you got Salathiel and Zerubbabel and all those others, and they were not on the throne, partially because for some of that time they were in Babylon. They didn't have the power.
Of course, like you said, Zerubbabel was either a governor of them or the governor of them.
Right. But
it's an interesting point you brought up about him. He was in the safe spot, sweet spot.
Yeah.
He was in power, but he wasn't.
Right. And that's why I say I think, to me, the presence of Zerubbabel indicates that we're not looking at his physical kingdom here. That he's looking for a spiritual kingdom. Which, wow, when we get to Zechariah, we're really going to talk about some spiritual things. We're really going to talk about some messianic prophecies. Okay, so get ready for that. So any other questions, comments? Thank you all very much for your presence. If you're taking the class for credit, you'll get a sweet little treat in the morning from me. And you may bring it back to me all decorated with your fancy words by next Monday night. You can bring it here or you can email it to me. Those taking it online, just email it to me by class time next week. All right. Thank y'all. Appreciate it. Have a good evening.
I have a crazy question. Maybe it's not crazy,
Go ahead.
but it throws me.
Okay.
Because when you look at this lineage of Christ and the generation of Christ, going another direction as far as what you were just saying about all these different kingdoms and different kings and whatnot, it throws me up saying, okay, even though he came from all this lineage of different people, but yet he was conceived by the Holy Spirit. So that just puzzles me, because basically God himself is basically all by himself. You know what I'm saying? He's all by himself. So how, it's a crazy question. So how could Christ come from this lineage of all these people with the Holy Spirit impregnated?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well, he's talking about
Through Mary.
Yeah, he's talking about through
right.
Mary in Luke's account, but he's talking about the families in which he would come.
Right.
He came from the promise made to Abraham in Genesis 12, and all those people in that lineage were in Abraham's seed, as was Mary. Okay, and again, specifically, the seed was to be the seed of woman. in Genesis chapter 3. So you're right, that God is essentially, truthfully, the real Father,
Right.
or the Spirit.
Because basically, this is all God's doing.
Right, right.
Well, and I wondered, could God have, if he chose to, used Joseph's DNA
Right.
to do it? I'm sure he could have if he wanted to have two different parts to make up Jesus. Or I'm sure he could have used all of Mary's DNA if he wanted to.
Right, because he specifically says the seed of woman, and it's typically the seed of man that's being
Right.
thought of. So it is the seed of the woman. And again, it's a little technical there, but
And I never thought about that. I've looked at this over and over.
Yeah.
Read it over and over. I didn't, look at it until that point, until you shed that light on it. And I'm thinking, no, wait a minute, let's back up. Basically, in so many words, how can Christ come from all of these in a sample of sense of it?
Mhm.
Because God impregnated
Right.
Mary.
But there again is when I think you need to go back to the fact that it is the seed of the woman
Right.
when she's going to come. That's it doesn't say the seed of the man. So, and Mary was in that lineage. So again, Luke 3 goes on that side of
Right.
the lineage. So I think that's how that would be explained.
So it's one I look at it totally
Yeah,
different now.
Yeah.
Wow.
very good. Interesting thought.
Yeah.
All righty. Good night, everybody.